welcome. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99, broadcasting from Kingston, but also broadcasting through our sister station, Irish Jam, in New York. So welcome to those of you who are joining me today. It's a very wet day. We've been experiencing consistent rainfall. Started out in the east of the island from before day yesterday morning. And it has continued, and then it has now spread right across the island. Now, certainly in my part of the world, it hasn't been raining heavily, but it's just raining consistently. And by that, what we will end up with is a lot of water that accumulates over time. And already I see some of the roads in the corporate area have water streaming down them, which means that some of the drains that are supposed to take that water perhaps have reached their capacity and can handle much more. The reports coming in indicate that many roads are flooded. Many roads across the island. I heard about impassable roads in Clarendon, in Portland, in St. Mary. Some water supply systems have been disrupted because of turbidity, a lot of mud in the water, and therefore they can't process the water, they can't treat it to put it in your pipes. And there are reports as well that some schools couldn't open today, and the parents have been advised by notices on radio not to send their children to school. So we're being affected, and all of this has to do with what up to yesterday, when it passed us, was a tropical depression. But it has now been upgraded to a tropical storm and given the name Ian. And it is expected that later today it is going to develop further, intensify into a major hurricane as it approaches the western part of Cuba. And then after it leaves Cuba, the forecast is that it will develop even further into a Category 3 and possibly a Category 4 hurricane. Now, if you want to know what a Category 4 hurricane is, remember Hurricane Gilbert that hit us in 1988, and remember all the damage and devastation that did. Well, Hurricane Gilbert, when it hit us, was a Category 3. It later went on to become, I think, a Category 5, or 4. But when it hit us, it was Category 3. Now, this fellow named Ian is likely to become, they say, certainly a Category 3 and possibly a Category 4. And then when it hits the Florida mainland, it will weaken somewhat into a storm and a depression again. You know, we in Jamaica have been so fortunate. I keep a close watch on, during the hurricane season, I keep a close watch on the forecast from all the reputable forecasting agencies, NOAA being the main one. And all of these hurricanes, they originate off the western coast of Africa, normally coming out of the Cape Verde archipelago. And they normally travel in an easterly direction. And if you were to draw a line in terms of the direction that they travel in, if you were to extend that line, it would be coming straight in our vicinity. But very often, halfway across the Atlantic, they tend to curve northeastwards. Sometimes they don't curve until after they have hit the Leewards and the Windward Islands. Sometimes they curve off before, but they normally curve off and go up into the central northern Atlantic. This fellow Ian, he didn't do anything of the sort. He was coming straight towards us, but instead of curving north, it curved south and went around us, and after it went around us, it curved north now to head towards Cuba. Some cynical people say, boy, Jamaica too rough, and not even Ian can handle it. So it give us a wide circle. But we really ought to be thankful, because those of us who have experienced hurricanes before. My first experience was in 1951 with Hurricane Charlie. A little bit of boy at the time. My mother put me under the bed because she felt that was the safest place for me to be. But after the hurricane passed, I was able to see outside and see all the damage that was done. So we've really been very fortunate. If you look at Fiona, Fiona curved northeast, then kept north, then curved northwest. And where did it end up? End up in Canada. The Atlantic coastline over on the eastern side of Canada, and has done significant damage to places like Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, Quebec, New Brunswick. I'm sure we have a whole bunch of Jamaicans living in those provinces, so I hope that, I'm not any reports as to how they are fared, but I hope that they have managed to withstand the stress. But we really ought to be fortunate. We ought to be grateful that we have escaped this one. Don't know how long we're going to be able to dodge that bullet. But I just want to put a word out there to people. We're having heavy rains, and those rains are likely to continue, I'm told, certainly into tomorrow. So I beg you, be cautious. Don't bother try cross roads that are flooded, or drains, or gullies, or rivers, and get washed away. And those who live on river banks, remember that the plenty water that is coming down is softening those banks, maybe even undermining those banks. And we have seen situations, certainly in places like Tavern, where after a while, the bank can't stand up anymore, and it just collapsed into the river. So I'm urging everybody, we don't want to have no casualties, don't want to hear about no children washed away. No, make us try and see if we can just weather this one and get back to normal. As I indicated before, we're broadcasting as well through Irish Jam in New York. Beauregard, what's happening?
Good afternoon, Mr. Golden.
How you doing? Tell me something. You've been watching what's happening up in Canada?
Yes, I'm surprised that the hurricane actually made its way all the way to Canada.
Because they normally don't reach Canada, no?
No.
And this one apparently is a big boy.
Yes, it is.
Big bad boy.
Yeah, fall started about 3 days ago here in the United States, and we saw where the weather dropped significantly, about 20 degrees. Like one day it was 80 degrees, the next day it was in the lower 60s. So
What are you saying to me? What is it today?
it is around 73 degrees today. It's much warmer than it's been over the weekend, about 10 degrees warmer. But when fall came around, it just came with, cold weather.
I was making a point, boy. I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's divine intervention, providence, or what. But when I watch hurricanes, when they leave the west coast of Africa, most of them, certainly over the last 10, 12 years, most of them, they travel in our direction and then they turn north. This one, travel in our direction and then turn south. And as soon as it had passed Negril Point, it turned north again. So it's either there's a divine hand protecting us, or as one person said to me today, boy, too much gunman out here, the storm can't manage them.
Wow, sir, like we said, the climate is definitely changing, and the way in which people used to see hurricanes operate is no longer operating in that order. The climate has definitely changed, and like you say, zigzagging all over the place. You don't know where it's going to end up.
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, Bo, because one of the things I don't understand, you see, is science is supposed to be, it's expected to be certain and exact.
Yes.
It's supposed to be precise. Science is supposed to not only tell you what is, but tell you what caused what is to be.
Yes.
And what I don't understand is how this business of climate change remains such a controversy.
Right.
Where, I mean, you had Donald Trump who said that it's a hoax. But it wasn't he alone. The president of Brazil, Bolsonaro,
Mm.
he don't believe in the climate change. I noticed over the last couple of days, last week I think it was, the president of the World Bank, can you believe that? The president
Mm.
of the World Bank
What did he
expressed
say?
doubt as to whether or not he really believes in climate change.
Oh.
And it shocked people so much that I gather the White House is now thinking of removing him because, he's appointed by the U.S. government.
Yes.
U.S. government appoints the president of the World Bank, and the European countries appoint the president of the IMF. I mean, that has been the practice and tradition. But he's likely to be out of a job. How can you have the World Bank is supposed to be one of the leading agencies helping countries like Jamaica and Cuba and so on to overcome climate
Change.
challenges. And the president of the World Bank is saying, boy, I'm not sure that anything named climate change. I've never heard anything like this in all my life.
We're going to have to watch and see where that leads as far as he is concerned. But, as human beings are living on the planet, Mr. Golden, I believe that, we need to find ways in which we can, use less energy and, take care of our environment, change some of our energy systems that we are using, protect our ecosystems as well as communities that human beings live in. And, just make sure that we take care of the ocean, take care of the forest, agriculture, things of that
Yeah, but
nature.
Bo, before you even get there, you're going to have to deal with the skeptics and the cynics. I can understand, if somebody with scientific data says, I'm challenging this reasoning,
Right.
or I'm challenging this finding that you make. Here is the data that I am presenting to challenge it. But you have people who are, challenge. I can't challenge a scientist who has spent years studying this thing. I can't challenge him unless I have a different scientist who is telling me, here is the data to challenge what the man is saying.
Right.
And we just, and in the meanwhile, of course, the response that ought to be coming from us, our reaction in terms of the things we do and the things that we must stop doing, all of that is being stymied because not everybody is fully accept that there's a thing called climate change, and it is something that is threatening the world, threatening the planet, and it requires a global response because everybody is in this thing together. What you do in America affects me here, and what I do here affects you up there.
True, sir.
But
So true.
I don't know. It's amazing.
Sometimes people knock down other people's ideas and ideologies without having a way of explaining theirs, and that might be what we're seeing
Yeah,
here.
but what frightens me is where it's coming from. It's coming from the mighty United States in terms of powerful voices there. Some in the Senate, a former president. It's coming from some of the emerging leaders in Europe. Now, if Europe and America cannot come to some understanding or
Yes.
come to some acceptance that this is a major problem that threatens the world,
Yes.
where is that to come from? The developing countries? They can't provide that leadership.
Right.
I don't know. Anyhow, that's what we're going to be talking about today. So
We're here
apparently
listening
quickly
on
as
this
we go
side.
through.
We're listening on this side, sir.
Yeah, okay. We're talking about climate change today when we come back. Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We're talking about climate change today, the impact of it, and what our response should be. Because we need to recognize some weird things have been happening. You look at the hurricane that hit Canada last week, the worst hurricane in their history. You look at the heat wave that hit China, the worst heat wave in China's history. You look at the flooding that took place 2 weeks ago in Pakistan, where I'm told from reports almost 1/3 of the entire country, and Pakistan is not a small country, almost 1/3 of the country was underwater. The worst flooding in its history. You look at the drought that is affecting countries in Europe and in Africa. the worst that they've ever experienced. You look at the wildfires that have burnt down thousands of acres in western United States, in Australia, the worst that they've ever experienced. So, you can have something that is the worst that you have experienced, but when you have so many of them happening around at about the same time, that has to be an indication that something is not right. Something is happening that didn't happen before. And therefore, there must be things that are causing it that require attention. And that's why I get very impatient and angry sometimes with the people who claim that climate change doesn't exist. It's like saying, well, smoking doesn't cause lung cancer, or saying that excessive fat in your diet doesn't cause obesity and don't cause hypertension. If the scientists have established that and proven it, God help me. I mean, why are we arguing over it? Let me bring in somebody who can help us understand this a little more, and that is Senator Sophia Frazer-Binns, who is the opposition spokesperson on climate change. Senator, welcome to the program.
So much for having me, Mr. Golden. I hope you're keeping it.
Help me with my frustration. The World Bank, as you would understand, because you would have had to deal with it in terms of your portfolio coverage. The World Bank is supposed to be one of the leading agencies helping developing countries to deal with climate change mitigation, adaptation, changing practices, and so on. The president of the World Bank last week comes out and says that he's not sure that he really believes anything named climate change. What is happening to the world?
Are you hearing me now, Mr. Golden?
I'm hearing you now, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me. The thing is that, the evidence in my mind is very clear that for the naysayers of climate change, I do not know what else that must happen for them to believe that the climate has changed. I was listening to your introduction earlier, and you mentioned a number of instances that has shown that, in fact, the climate has changed. And let us come back right here in Jamaica. Almost every month, we have an example of how our weather pattern has changed. And you do know that climate change shows itself in how our weather patterns. So our intense rainfall, for example, is one of the things that we're seeing more and more in Jamaica. The increased number of flooding is one of the things that we're seeing more and more in Jamaica. The impact even on our agricultural industry. In my mind, all of those things indicate that climate change is real. The heat that we're experiencing daily, just this past summer, Jamaica experienced a heat wave. The fact is that we cannot continue as before, and we cannot continue to deny the existence of climate change. In reference to the specific question you asked, I believe that for the world to truly rally around climate change, then it is going to mean that the leaders of all our institutions must come to a consensus that climate change is real. In Jamaica, you do know that next year it is said that Kingston will experience what is called climate departure. I don't know if I may continue, but climate departure essentially is where the hottest temperature in the past becomes the lowest temperature in the present. That's what it is. And Kingston, Jamaica is slated to experience climate departure next year, 2023.
Let me ask you this. To what extent are we, and by we I mean we in Jamaica, but I want to extend that we to include countries that are in a similar state of development to Jamaica. To what extent are we victims or are we perpetrators?
To be honest with you, small island developing states, and I want to just talk specifically about the Caribbean, we really are the least contributor to climate change, but we are the greatest victims of climate change. By virtue of the fact that we are small island developing states, in other words, we are surrounded by water. We are the ones who are most affected by rising temperature. We're the ones who are most affected because our financial economy is impacted by climate change. So when you have hurricanes, when you have tropical depression or tropical storms like we're experiencing now, and you have to divert funding to fix our roads or to deal with other infrastructural damages that occur, then that affects our ability to look after our people. And this is not unique to Jamaica. This is something that they experience right across in small island developing states. It affects our ability to really put in place the type of mechanisms and schools and resources that are required in our education system. So though we are the least contributors, the fact is that we're the ones who stand to be impacted the worst and the most by virtue of us being small island developing states.
And you know, Senator, Jamaica is not the worst off. I remember years ago at a Commonwealth Heads of Government conference, I remember the then Prime Minister of Bahamas making the point that if sea levels continue to rise at the rate that they were rising at that time, in 50 years' time, half of the Bahamas Islands would disappear.
Absolutely.
And then the president of the Maldives who was there said half of the Bahamas, all of the Maldives would be underwater.
Indeed. And it is coming to fore because, again, and I like to use the example of what's happening in Hellshire because almost every Jamaican knows about Hellshire and would have gone to Hellshire at some point to enjoy the fish we have there. And, you know, if you have kids, you'll take your kids there for the beach. But when you go to Hellshire now, you can have fish, but there's no beach. And if we continue like this, then the persons who ply their trade, they will not have anywhere to ply their trade because the water would come all the way up because of rising temperature and because the water continues to go on to the beach. But the other thing as well, and that's just Hellshire, but let us look at our coastal communities and our tourism product. All of these stand to be impacted by climate change. Housing stand to be impacted by climate change. And when I talk about housing, I'm not just talking about the fact that people who live in coastal communities, their homes will be eroded, but we're talking about the price of housing will also be impacted because of climate change. And these are some of the reality that we have to treat with. If I may just share with you an example that in 2008, Hurricane Ivan, the damage of Hurricane Ivan accounted for 8% of the GDP of Jamaica. 8%. And last year when we had a number of storms, not hurricanes, over $10 billion was spent just on dealing with the damages from these tropical storms. And I'm waiting to see what the cost for the damage coming from this tropical storm will be. But the fact is that we can't continue to deny the existence of climate change because it touches and concerns every aspect of our life, from the financial aspect to our housing to our health. And that's another thing that, you know, when we talk about climate change, Mr. Golden, we do not talk about the public health implications of climate change. And I think it is something that we have to start talking about more and more because as we have rising temperature, we're going to be having more persons affected by public health issues given as a result of climate change.
Tell me, what can we do and what should we do
the first thing
to protect ourselves?
Well, we can't truly protect ourselves in terms of, you know, what we can do is to mitigate and adapt. And you know that those are the buzzwords that we use in climate change. First of all, is there has to be an acceptance that climate change does exist. The second thing is we have to also agree that everybody has a role to play. In terms of how we're going to mitigate and adapt, there are certain things that everybody can do. There are things that the government must do, but there are certain things that the individual can do. Things which perhaps seem basic but critical is the cutting down of trees. We have to find a way to stop cutting down our trees because trees, apart from the fact that, you know, they help in terms of they're the lungs of the atmosphere, the environment, what they do as well is they help in tapering off the waterfall and the intensity of the waterfall. So when rain falls, the leaves of the tree act almost like a canvas. So instead of the water coming down full force, what it does is it helps in terms of the force of the water hitting the soil and it reduces soil erosion. So that's the point I want to come. So it reduces soil erosion. The other thing as well is that in a very rare way, we have to understand that climate change affects our personal lives. I think the conversation that we have not done is we haven't shown everybody how individuals will be affected by climate change. So when you have flooding, for example, and you can't send your children to school, that is as a result of climate change. When you have flooding and the government has to diversify the funds from the hospitals or from the education system to deal with the damages that affects your life. And I think that is how we need to put the conversation.
You mentioned the cutting down of trees. What else are we doing? How else are we contributing to climate change problems?
What we're doing as well in terms of climate change is that we have been, and this is not limited to individuals, I think on a macro level, we have not been utilizing our lands in the best way. So part of what we have to do is a reassessment of our land utilization, because with climate change comes a direct effect on economy, on the agricultural sector. So it means, therefore, that food security is going to be impacted. So we're going to have to make sure that we utilize our land so that we can produce and we can become food secure. So that is something I think that all of us need to do, and that is something I think needs to be led by the government. Whichever government is in power at the time is something that must be led by the government. Something that happens almost in every backyard, particularly, not limited to, but particularly in rural parishes, is the burn in our backyard. Again, we have to stop. It may seem minuscule, but the truth is that if everybody burns in their backyard, then that is something that is going to impact us. And we know about the heat, and we know about the ozone layer. We know what it means for us, and all of that is climate change. We have been learning about it from high school and some persons from prep school. Those are some of the things that we have got to stop doing to ensure that we protect the environment. Another thing as well, and it still is in its infancy stage, but a lot of research has been going on about it, is just housing and the type of material that we use for housing. And as a country who relies so much on the housing and sector, then we have to ensure that the type of material we use in our building are materials that are eco-friendly. So we have to make sure that we use solar panels more. We have to make sure that our buildings are green, because all of these things impact on the environment.
But I'm not discounting anything at all that you have said. I endorse them 100%. But let us say that we got to a point where we no longer cut down a single tree, where we don't dump our garbage in the gullies, where we manage our lands in a perfectly rational, sustainable way. We do all of those things. That is not going to stop the ice cap from melting. That is not going to stop the frequency of strange climate events that will leave a trail of death and destruction. Governments of countries like ours speak out about it. I mean, I've heard the Prime Minister speak about it. Prime Minister Mayor Motley has been a stalwart in terms of speaking to the international community about it. But who is listening to them, Sophia?
Well,
who is responding? I mean, what is causing all this problem? Is what is happening in America, what is happening in Russia, what is happening in China, what is happening in India. They are belching out all kind of not such things in the atmosphere. They are creating the problem.
And they're
not paying no attention.
And they're the main contributor. And that is it, you hit the nail on the head, because the truth is that as an individual state, Jamaica's power is limited, and we accept that. But we also know that there is power in numbers. So it can't be a fight for Jamaica alone. It has to be, and it can't be a fight just for CARICOM, because with the 15 countries in CARICOM, we're still small in comparison.
Can I give you an anecdote which will explain to you the kind of difficulties we have? Sure. When we had COP16 meeting in Copenhagen, I sent the Deputy Prime Minister, late Ken Ball, because I felt that we needed a strong delegation there. And I kept in constant touch with him because we were on the cusp of a landmark agreement in terms of the reduction targets. And I was amazed that when he told me at one stage how many votes they had lined up and they were confident that they were going to get through, within the last 48 hours before the vote was taken, he told me that countries were dropping out. What was happening? The developed countries were calling them one by one and cutting a deal. A grant of so much, a loan, soft loan of so much to build some new highway and some new bridge and that kind of stuff. I mean, they were picking them off one by one.
And
it puts a small country who is looking at a kind of funding for development that it has never got its hands on yet, and therefore it's quite, it weighs. It says, well, climate change is a long-term thing. Let me grab this loan now because this can ensure my re-election when I get back home. How you fight that?
And you're quite correct, and that is why I say that it can't be a one country or one region. What is going to happen is that all small island developing states will have to come together. And it seems idealistic, but there's no other way. We have to take a particular position as small island developing states, not limited to CARICOM, to say this is it, and we negotiate as a bloc. You do recall with the LOMIS 4 and the ACP countries, and they negotiated as a bloc and the benefits that could be derived. In this age, in 2022, with everything that is happening, we have to negotiate as a team because there's power in number. The other thing as well, which I think is going to be important to all of us as small island developing states, is that we have to, and I think Prime Minister may have mentioned it, and I think our Prime Minister may have mentioned it as well when he spoke the other day, we have to also move as a group and negotiate for better financial terms, because it can't be that we have all these international debt, whether bilateral or multilateral debts, that we have to be paying off, that we are so impacted by climate change and all its effects. Something is going to have to give. So we have to, and when we find ourselves one, with some of the debt being written off or reduced, then you find that we're in a better position financially, so we don't have to negotiate one-on-one and take any behind-the-scene dealings. Because the truth is that the role of every government, and you will appreciate this, is that you want to do what is best for your country.
The developed countries. Sorry, go ahead.
Right, and sometimes it means that you will have to agree bilaterally or multilaterally, but at the expense of what? So what needs to happen is, one, is that there has to be a coming together of all the small island developing states to negotiate better financial treatment of small island developing states. And secondly, from that, then I believe that all the things that are negotiated, whether it's going to be COP27 when it comes up next month, or whatever negotiation is taking place, that we negotiate as a bloc. I believe that unless and until we start treating the issue of climate change, one, as part and parcel of the development and the continued existence of small island developing states, then we will not go further, because we can do everything that I've mentioned earlier in terms of stop cutting on the trees and our public education. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, is that our contribution to climate change is very, very small compared to the effect of it.
I recall, I can't recall the specific numbers, but the developed countries have made certain financial commitments to assist developing countries to adapt, to put in mitigation measures and so on. I don't remember the numbers. You may be more familiar with them than I am now, because I've looked at them for a long time. But last time that I checked, a lot of those countries that made those pledges, they can't find where to put the checkbook. I mean, so we get these wonderful pledges, wonderful commitments. I'm questioning the commitment, and particularly now that some of those leaders of developed countries, not only Trump, but one or two of the leaders that have emerged recently in Western Europe, are throwing cold water on this whole climate change concern. It makes me worried. I have 6 grandchildren, I mean, I won't be around when the autoclaps come, but I mean, they have a life that they ought to be allowed to live.
And the fact of the matter is that the Secretary General of the UN mentioned it as well, that, and I'm paraphrasing, but the 1.5 is really on life support. And I wait to see what is going to happen at COP27. But the fact is that the developed countries, they are particularly concerned with ensuring that they stay developed. And we get that. And it is for that reason that small island developing states, and I have to keep pressing on this point, have to find ways to work together, because they don't care and they're doing what they have to do in the interest of their people, but we are the ones who are going to be impacted by it. I am waiting to see, I'm still reading all the reports coming out of UNGA. I'm waiting to see how we move forward as a team going into COP27. But it would be interesting to see how, coming out of the UN General Assembly, that the CARICOM and other small island developing states move together. Because it is my view that we can talk all we want about loss and damage, and that's the other buzzword that we're using, but until or unless we move as a team, as a pack, then I don't believe that real focus and commitment will be given to some of these issues that we're having.
Go ahead. Finish your point.
Go ahead. It just came out. Sorry.
Yeah. As cynical as it may sound, the one thing that gives me more hope than anything else, when you see Fiona last week tear through the Atlantic and the eastern coast of Canada, man, Canada is not the worst of the culprits. When you see, for example, that Europe this year has experienced record-breaking drought in some areas, and other parts of Europe have experienced record-breaking heat wave. China, record-breaking heat wave. Australia, record-breaking floods. Maybe when these things happen, those countries, those developed countries, because they're the ones with the clout, they're the ones with the money. Siberia, the Danube has sunken to such a low level that it has now exposed German warboats that they never knew they had disappeared and sunk. They didn't know where they were until the river had gone down so low now that they're picking up relics of warboats all over the place. Now, maybe when it gets that bad, if it's not too late, then these countries will realize that this thing is no joke. And they will start putting some money where their mouth is, or where their promises are. I don't know. I may be cynical, but maybe that, my grandmother used to tell me, if you can't hear, you must feel.
Well, I don't know if it is cynical. I think it is hopeful. And those who feel it knows it. And I think that is why the CARICOM countries have been so very active in terms of our advocacy for support, and particularly on the financial side of things, and resources for mitigation and adaptation, because we experience this.
Are you aware of any funds flowing from this climate change fund that was set up to any of the CARICOM countries?
Yes, CARICOM countries have in fact benefited from various funds. I mean, whether it is the GEF or the other funds that we have, the governments of the world have established, we have benefited from them. There's been support in terms of agriculture and women. There's been support for young people in agriculture. There's been financial support for adaptation as well. But the challenge we have is that the funds that have been made available over the years really is just what you call a drop in the bucket compared to the challenges that we're having. So there's been support, financial support for mangroves, for example. But the destruction of mangroves is so wide and extensive, and the period that it takes for mangroves to grow is so long that you still can't feel the immediate effect. So I go back to one of the things I said earlier about the need for us to have greater financial support from these international organizations and from the developed countries, so that we can have the mitigation and adaptation efforts more effective and felt throughout the Caribbean. I mean, Jamaica, I know, has benefited, but as I said, the funds are so limited that the kind of effect that you would anticipate is just not there.
Do you know whether we're doing anything in our schools to sensitize our young people?
There is the program that the Jamaica Environmental Trust has. They had an environmental program in schools through the environmental clubs. The last time I checked, I know that was discontinued due to financial support. I am not sure whether any support has been given for that to recommend. That is what I'm aware of. I also know that recycling partners, once you approach them, they will assist you in terms of getting you bins and stuff for recycling of plastic bottles. But outside of that, I am not aware of any other specific program throughout schools that deal with, how we deal with climate change prevention and responding to climate change and the issues therefrom.
And we perhaps need to do some more in terms of public education as well.
Absolutely. And the thing about it is, and we have been talking a lot about climate change as a country, but what we have not done is we haven't shown the individual how climate change affects their personal lives. And so, to a large extent, it is still very academic. And because it's academic, then people are not drawn to the conversation. One of the things we have to do in our public education is to break it down in a very simple way that the man on the JUTC bus can understand how climate change is going to affect his life and what he can do to deal with the effects of climate change.
Senator Sophia Frazer-Binns, thank you so much. I know you have another commitment and you have to go. But I want to thank you for coming on and adding value to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Sure.
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. And we're broadcasting as well, not just here in Jamaica, but we're broadcasting to New York through Irish. Today we're talking about climate change. I'm very pleased now to welcome Professor Anthony Clayton, who is the Alcan Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. And he has written quite frequently and extensively on the matter of climate change. Professor Clayton, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Golding.
Can I ask you to presume that I am completely ignorant and know nothing at all about climate change, and explain to me and for the benefit of our listeners, when we talk about climate change, I'm worried that, it becomes a kind of cliche, a kind of buzzword. Can you explain in as simple terms as possible what is climate change and what it is that we ought to be concerned about?
Right. Well, the climate that makes our life possible is actually quite a complex, dynamic process. And there are a number of very important factors like amount of energy we get from the sun, biological activity on the earth and so forth that maintains the temperature and the oxygen level in the atmosphere. Now, what is starting to happen is that we have been adding a number of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And these are slowing down the rate at which heat can leak back out into space. And so what is happening as a result is that our atmosphere is getting warmer. It's now close to 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than it would have been otherwise, mainly as a result of carbon dioxide, which we've been adding to the atmosphere. And we are probably within the next 3 or 4 years, going to pass the 1.5 degree average temperature rise in the Earth's atmosphere as a result. Now, what that means is that we are going to see a number of consequences. And the ones that we're particularly worried about is firstly that the ice that's currently in Greenland, probably that's going to start melting. And the other problem is...
What happens when it melts?
Sea level goes up by about 7 meters, at which point we lose a lot of our coastal cities.
Right.
The other big problem is that
you'll probably lose most of the Bahamas.
Well, yes, and there are parts of the world, like Cayman Islands, about half of the entire land area of Bangladesh, which will be underwater at that point.
Yes.
So we're looking at a future where we could be looking at several 100 million environmental refugees, people who are having to migrate away from parts of the world where it's no longer possible for humans to live. And this will give us an enormous problem because we're going to have to find ways to absorb these very large flows of environmental refugees. And it's not at all clear how well we're going to manage doing that.
How would it affect our economic activities? Agriculture, for example.
Well, we are already looking at implications for agriculture and land use in many parts of the world. You remember the extensive fires that we had in North America, Canada, Russia, Australia the last couple of years ago. Well, that may become much more frequent occurrence. It's generally believed that in 10 years from now, we could see extensive fires doing approximately double the damage that the last round of major forest fires did. Because the forests are dry out. And it means that when you do have an event like a lightning strike, the fire is much more likely to start, and it's much more likely to be extremely extensive. But the big challenge is going to be what happens to our centers of human settlement. If we get anywhere close to 3 degrees of temperature rise, which we're projected to do by about the end of the century, then there's close to 600 cities which are going to be partially or wholly flooded. And that includes major cities like Miami, New York, Kolkata, Mumbai, and Dhaka. And at this point, we're looking at probably $1 trillion a year worth of costs in relocating people.
Tell me, when did this start? How long has it been going on? For example, what impact did the Industrial Revolution have on the atmosphere?
Well, it started around about the time of the first Industrial Revolution. But, of course, that's been 1750. But most of the impact is recent. And the rate at which we've been adding carbon to the atmosphere has accelerated markedly. And the major drivers now are the development of countries like China and India. China is now the world's largest carbon emitter. It emits twice as much as the United States. And India is in third place. And these countries have got a lot of new coal-based power stations in development. China alone has got about 1,200 more power stations under development, which means that there's really very little hope now, realistically, that we're going to be able to stop the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And my own guess is that we're going to go well past 2, somewhere probably closer to 2.5 degrees, before we can now start reducing the rate of global warming. And that's a fairly optimistic assessment.
Well, help me now, because the information you're passing on to us, that information is science-based, and I imagine that that information has been gathered through many years of detailed, painstaking research and capturing of data and events and so on.
Right.
Why, Professor Clayton, why is this business of climate change still an issue of controversy? I was amazed to discover, you probably have noticed it. Last week, the president of the World Bank, of all institutions, the president of the World Bank expressed some doubt as to the authenticity of all this stuff about climate change. He's probably going to lose his job for it. But President Trump said it was a hoax. President Bolsonaro in Brazil has scoffed at it.
Yes.
Why are we having, I mean, if we're not talking about arts and literature now, we're talking about science that has to be based on hard facts that have to be proven.
Yes.
Why is this, because if we don't get past this controversy, we're not going to be able to develop an appropriate global response.
Yes. I think there's perhaps 2 main reasons. The first is that we're talking about very large, very complex systems here. Now, what happens in the atmosphere is affected by hundreds of variables. And we can make projections, but of course there is still always going to be some level of uncertainty. So it depends on the decisions that we're going to make today. I can't tell you that we are going to get 2.5 degrees of temperature rise. It depends on, for example, how quickly can we develop low carbon sources of energy and how quickly we can persuade people to move over to low carbon sources of energy. And so it's not a determinate figure. This is a scenario. This is what would happen if we stay on the current path. Now, some people find this whole discussion very uncomfortable. It threatens they think it threatens their way of life. It may threaten their investments. And so this is a discussion which they deal with essentially by saying, well, I don't believe it. It's not going to happen. If I feel that the problem is, the tragedy is, that these people are probably not going to see the worst consequences. It will be our children who do, and their grandchildren, and our grandchildren, their children. And I fear that for the generation that is coming up now, the consequences will be very obvious and very terrible. There are parts of the world, like, for example, Bangladesh, which much of which we believe is going to go underwater. Parts of the world where the Middle East and north of India, where we think that the temperature will be too high for people to survive. And so we're going to see, we believe, if we stay on this current path, that large parts of the world's surface becoming uninhabitable. And these people will pay a terrible price for the fact that we're not acting at the rate that we would need to act if we're going to avoid the worst case future scenario.
To what extent? Can I ask you just pause, because New York has to leave us at 1 o'clock, and I just wanted to hail them up and say goodbye. Beauregard.
Of course.
Yes, Mr. Golden.
I hope it warms up a little bit tonight.
I'm not sure about that, but we'll continue to watch it, sir.
You having your own climate change challenges. All right, Bo, nice to hear you.
You too, sir. Take care.
We'll link up next week.
All right.
We're going to take a break shortly, Professor Clayton, but one of the questions I'm going to ask you when you come back to address for me is, to what extent is Jamaica and countries like Jamaica, by like Jamaica I mean countries at our stage of economic development, of our size and our stage of economic development, to what extent in this climate change thing, to what extent are we victims or perpetrators? When we come back, if you could address that for me.
Of course.
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99 and we're flying solo now because Jam had to leave us. Jam in New York. We're talking with Professor Anthony Clayton. He's the distinguished Alcan Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. And I know the environment and climate change in particular have been part of his passion. I pose a question as to whether countries like us, like ours, whether we are victims of the climate change debacle, or whether we are contributing in however small a way to it. What do you say?
I say we're both. We're both perpetrators and we're going to be victims. And may I give you an example? This is something that happened a few years ago at the 5th Summit of the Americas. Trinidad was in support of a proposal that would have countries contribute to a compensation fund to allow for the harm done by their policies. The idea is that countries which were victims would be beneficiaries. At the last minute, Trinidad withdrew the proposal because they just realized that they would actually be a net contributor. They're a high per capita carbon emitter. So they were only in favor as long as they thought they were going to be beneficiaries.
They weren't about to cut their own throat.
They were indeed. So I don't like this idea that you are either a perpetrator or a victim. In practice, I think we're all of us both. And the fact that some countries are going to suffer more does not, in fact, in any way absolve those governments from behaving like responsible governments and taking all steps possible to build resilience into their economies and to try to move people away into less exposed areas. For example, here in Jamaica, one of the things that we could do and should have been doing for some years now is to stop giving people permission to build down by water's edge. We need, over time, to start to migrate centers of population onto higher ground. We need to be looking now for another international airport, because both Norman Manley and the airport at Mo Bay are going to be at risk from sea level rise. So over time, we can put the planning framework in place, start to move infrastructure, start to move people, and of course the cost would be spread over decades. So it would be something that we could afford to do. And that way, even when things get really bad, we will have far fewer people in harm's way, and the impact on the economy would be greatly reduced.
Tell me.
So these are the sorts of steps that I think any responsible government should be taking from now.
Tell me, we hear ever so often, and up to last week, wonderful speeches, well written, whether delivered at a COP gathering or whether delivered at the General Assembly. What is your frank assessment of the strength of commitment of the developed countries, of the leaders of the developed countries, to really tackling this issue?
I think it's a very mixed picture. You can find people in every country who understand the science. You can find people in every country who are very clear, very passionate about the need for change. And you can also find people who don't want to believe this is going on, who are reluctant to engage with the arguments. And of course, you can also find substantial vested interest in not making a profound change to the structure of the economy. If we start to drive our economy in the direction of greater efficiency, much more efficient transport systems, energy systems, water systems, reconstructing our urban environment, we know how to do this. We know how to put up buildings that actually have net zero energy cost. We know in principle how to reduce the energy demand of our transport sector by about 80%, mainly by moving to an all-electric vehicle fleet and autonomous vehicles. These technologies are on the market or near market now. So we know what we need to do. But of course, you're talking about threatening a lot of investment, sunk costs, and sunk investment in infrastructure that potentially is going to have to be sacrificed, and in obsolete technologies. And you're always going to get resistance when you come along and propose those kinds of fundamental structural reforms to an economy.
But tell me, are the developed countries, which stand to lose more, particularly smaller than states, are the developing countries, are they all at one?
No,
let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Back in, I think it was 2010 or 2011, I don't remember. It was COP16 in Copenhagen, when we thought at one stage that we were going to be able to nail down the 1.5 cap. We thought we had the votes. And in the last 48 hours before the vote was taken, some of those that we thought were on board suddenly disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And what we discovered is that they were busy in some room somewhere negotiating some big development loan.
Yes.
To build a new airport or to build a new highway. And when we got to the vote, we realized that we didn't have the numbers.
Yes.
And I don't believe that strategy has disappeared. I believe it is still there to be used whenever it's appropriate. When are we going to be able to get it right?
I have learned that you can't expect people to always be angels. We know that countries like India and China, for example, which are now among the world's largest carbon emitters, have taken the view that for the purposes of this discussion, they should still be classed as developing countries and therefore should be given various exemptions and so forth, some restrictions. Whereas in the post-industrial economies, we're actually seeing carbon emissions per unit of GDP falling, and they have been for some years now. Now, a lot of people think because of the historical responsibility of the last generation industrial nations, they should pay more. And that's a legitimate position. But of course, it is also true that what really counts is the total tonnage of carbon going into the atmosphere. And at that stage, it is no longer the last generation of industrial nations that are the primary drivers. It is, in fact, China, which is emitting more than double the level of the entire United States.
Where does India fall?
Where do we number 3 in third place, just after the United States? So you've now got the new generation industrial powers, which are actually contributing much more to today's carbon emissions than the last generation of industrial powers. So there are real questions as to now who is in the moral right about this. I don't think it actually makes sense to be too concerned about who has to be on the moral high ground on this debate. The important thing is that we find solutions and implement solutions as quickly as possible. And we really find ways to drive everybody's economy towards greater efficiency and decarbonization. And if we can do that, then we all win.
Is the conversation now taking place within the international community? Is that conversation, does it have enough muscle? Is it peripheral to international concerns? In other words, are we dealing with this as a creeping emergency? Or are we simply dealing with it as some long-term thing that we can deal with over the next two or three generations?
Well, I think the problem here is you always have two different kinds of emergency. There's the chronic one, which goes on in the background for years and may steadily be getting worse. And there's the acute one, which you have to deal with immediately. So the war in Ukraine, for example, which took something like 30% of the world's traded grain off the market, was an immediate and acute crisis. Whereas climate change, people have been hearing about it for decades, and they don't think it's getting worse. Unfortunately, the science tells us very clearly that not only has it got steadily worse, we're also very close now to the tipping point at which we will actually start to see truly catastrophic consequences. But because people have been hearing about it for years, they think that the problem isn't really worth the same level of attention. And as you were saying earlier, it's not really, I think, so much what happens in the international arena, where we do get a lot of fine words, although not very much action. But as you were saying earlier, it's domestic politics where the concerns really trump climate change. So if you have an economy which is taken a hit from a 2-year COVID pandemic, or many countries now, they're caught in a vice with rising energy costs, import costs, food import costs, and falling incomes, then they will tend to put those domestic considerations top of the agenda, and something that is not yet killing people, or not too many people, like climate change, they'll deal with that when they get around to it.
To what extent, Professor, are we nearing a tipping point? In the sense that, record-breaking heat waves in Europe, in China, record-breaking floods in Pakistan, in sections of China too, record-breaking drought in some parts of Europe. I'm told the Danube has fallen so low that it is now exposing German warships that people didn't know were sitting there.
That's right.
Are we at a point now where our eyes are going to be forced open, or are we just going to turn a blind eye to all that is happening and try and deal with it as an immediate problem? So we get hit by a flood, well, we try and provide relief to the people, and we try and rebuild some houses without paying attention to what caused that flood.
Yes. I think my own personal guess is that we are now quite close to about 5 tipping points. A total of nearly 20 tipping points have been identified. But a lot of them, the first 5, cluster around about the 1.5 degree rise in temperature mark. And we are probably going to go past that within the next 4 or 5 years, certainly by 2030. At that point, we could start to see some irreversible changes. And this is at the point at which we will start to see consequences which are really catastrophic for large parts of humanity. I hope to God that we don't get there, but unfortunately, human nature tends to suggest that we won't really take action until we do.
Is it too far-fetched? Is it theoretically possible that if we don't address this situation, that the planet could eventually become uninhabitable?
Well, it won't become uninhabitable for other forms of life, but we could conceivably, although I have to say it's very, very unlikely, we could conceivably make life untenable for a large part of humanity, yeah.
Yes.
I don't, this is all potentially avoidable. It depends at what point people start to say, okay, we need to accelerate the development and deployment of low-carbon energy technologies. At what point we have to say, okay, we're going to take all internal combustion engines off the road by a given date and have all electric vehicles from now on. Well, in fact, Europe started to do things like that. They've actually set a timeline. It's still far ahead in the future, at which it will no longer be possible to sell gasoline and diesel-powered engines. So they are starting to drive this now. A lot of these changes still look a little bit like too little, too late, but the fact that these steps are now being taken gives me some reason for feeling cautiously optimistic.
Some effort is being made.
Some effort is being made in some parts of the world, yes. I think that's as strong as we can put it just now.
Well, perhaps the most encouraging note on which we can end.
It's not entirely encouraging, but yeah. I'm looking for the most optimistic way I can put this.
Professor Clayton, thank you so very much. You've been very helpful to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Golding. Always a pleasure.
Bye-bye. That was Professor Anthony Clayton, the Alcan Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development. Useful thoughts, useful contribution, I think, to this discussion. Let's take a break. So we're very pleased now to be joined by Miss Danielle Nembhard, who is a marine scientist and climate advocate. Miss Nembhard, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Well, it's morning for me. Sorry. Good afternoon, Mr. Golding.
Yeah, I should point out that you're talking to us all the way from Australia.
Yes, I am. It's 4:20 in the morning.
4:20. And you allowed me to disturb your night rest?
Well, it's an important topic, so I felt it necessary to come on. And I'll never deny an opportunity to share my thoughts on climate change.
That's so kind of you. I want to thank you even more for that. Give me your assessment. This battle that is being fought by people like yourself, are you winning the battle, or are you simply fighting, or are you losing the battle?
It's many, many battles that we're fighting. Some we are winning, some we are not winning as much as we'd want to, and some we don't know the outcome just as yet. The thing with climate change is that it's an emissions problem. So there are countries and industries that are emitting high amounts of carbon into the Earth's atmosphere that's causing this greenhouse effect. Can
you pause there for one moment, because you just said something,
sure,
and I would love to nail it down. And it's consistent, I believe, with what Professor Clayton was saying earlier. How much of our climate change crisis is due to emissions?
So I would say if we didn't have the large quantities of emissions that we have had in the last 5 or 6 or so decades, we wouldn't have the crisis on our hands that we do now. Yes, the Earth's climate does change naturally, and there are, periods and seasons of more extreme weather, but climate change that is human-derived, meaning through carbon emissions, is really the root cause of the issues that we're having right now. And that is backed by science.
And the emissions are primarily energy-driven.
Yes, so we do have emissions from the energy and the use of fossil fuels. And the use of fossil fuels is high in different sectors. So like the transport sector, the agriculture sector, and the energy sector. These are sectors that are extremely high emitters of carbon.
I had interrupted you, and you were making a point, and I don't know if you recall what it was. But remember, I asked you the question as to whether we're winning or losing the battle.
Yes, I mean, we're making some strides in terms of basically from Jamaica's perspective, from the Caribbean's perspective, and I would say from island nations and developing countries. There is no recognition of the impacts that more developed countries or industrialized nations are having on the climate crisis, in terms of the fact that they are very high emitters, and most of the impact is being felt by us, who are very small emitters, right? So the top, let's say, 3 countries emit over 60% or 40% of the world's carbon, versus if you combine all of the 140 small countries remaining, we're emitting next to nothing, but we're feeling all of these impacts. So there is recognition of that.
But are the big boys listening to us, or are they just giving us some polite responses?
Well, it's hard to say if the responses are just polite right now. I think definitely some countries are not interested in the conversation, and they've made that quite clear in their actions. So let's say even where I am right now in Australia, they've just voted in a new government that says they are more climate friendly and climate conscious, and they want to take climate action, but they continue to sign on new fossil fuel projects when the IPCC report that came out earlier said we have no chance of basically addressing the climate crisis if we continue to sign new fossil fuel projects into the future.
No.
So
tell me, the gung-ho people like you, and I'm using that in a broad sense, have you been able to put before the prime emitters an alternative path that would not cause their demise? Have we said to the Chinas, for example, this is where you can go, this is how you can do it? Yes, it will require some adjustment, but and America too. Yes, it will require some adjustment, but look, your grandchildren are going to be able to live in an environment that is sustainable. Have we kind of walked them through that?
Absolutely. Right? So different countries, different coalitions, different alliances have all put forward alternatives where we can have transitions away from a dependence on fossil fuel towards more renewable sources of energy. All of this has been put forward, right? So America has their Green New Deal, and they have signed on some new policies and legislation since this year that are basically looking at that just transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. The UK not doing so well on that front. China definitely is making some strides in that regard. So things like the solutions for this transition, the solutions to decrease our dependence on fossil fuels have been presented. They're there, the pathways are there, but there's also a lot of power and, let's say, money that's tied up in the fossil fuel industry across sectors. So we're talking about people who are invested in a different way than let's say us, who are talking about future generations. They're talking about their equity right now, and they're trying to secure that equity.
Well, that's why I pose the question, because I believe it would be important to some accommodation has to be found for them as well, So if we're talking about how to make that transformation, one has to take into account that, they have a lot of investment in this thing, so we have to pull them out of it, but they have to be part of the equation, no?
They do. And I mean, to counter that or to add to that, I'd say it's not like they were not aware of climate change around the same time that scientists or the wider, broader community has been aware. So there was a huge expose or, series of investigations done last year on, let's say, a giant fossil fuel industry or company that had a whole climate change division, right? They had scientists that noted the impacts of climate change, noted the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions, and they even had a renewable energy section of their business. But they made a decision to continue to pursue fossil fuel because of their bottom line. And for this specific company, they actually put out misinformation. They actually put out propaganda to say climate change is not real, but they knew it was. So there's a different sides to this conversation. There are some companies, there are some industries that have fought against climate action over the years, while others have been more accommodating. So you do have, energy companies, for example, that fund adaptation initiatives or that fund, restoration of degraded ecosystems, or they give money to communities who have felt the largest impacts. But they have always been involved in the conversation. So it comes a point, definitely now, where we have to decide what is more important for us to protect. Is it going to be the life and livelihoods of us now and future generations? Because we can't keep saying future generations anymore. Because as you can see with Pakistan, with China this year and their drought, in Africa, they're already having impacts. It's not a future generations problem. We're having the issues right now. Right, so we have to decide how much are we gonna concede? How much can we afford to give up in this fight?
Let me ask you this: the COP dialogue is almost 3 decades old, no? To what
Yes,
extent? To what extent do you think that over the last decade that we have made more headway than we made in the first two?
I want to say no. I think all that's happened in the last decade is a little bit of back and forth. If you read COP reports, for example, you can notice certain patterns and trends where they choose to leave out certain words because they don't want to trigger people or they don't want to seem too extremist. So there's been this kind of switch to more neutral and accommodating language and actions where people are not committing to what they need to commit to if we really intend to address this issue. So, for example, if you look at things like reduction in carbon emissions, every country that signed on to the UNFCCC has to make those commitments, their nationally determined contributions.
Can I ask you to just
Sure.
We need to take a break and I want to bowl a ball at you. Can you hold a minute for me?
Yeah.
And we're very pleased to have on the line with us Miss Danielle Nembhard, who is a marine scientist and climate advocate. And as you would have detected from her voice, she's a Jamaican, but is currently in Australia. Miss Nembhard, do you want to share with us what you're doing in Australia? Why don't come home?
Well, Australia, a university here, thankfully gave me a scholarship to do my PhD. And funny enough, I am looking at issues of climate justice and environmental justice
Wonderful.
in my PhD.
Well, I hope you'll bring that back and help us to get on board some of these things. Tell me, would you agree with me? I'm almost sure you would. That perhaps the most critical thing in this fight is the strength of leadership, particularly coming from those major countries that are the big emitters, no? And we're talking about China. I gather the order number 1, 2, 3: China, U.S., India, and then there are others that we need to throw in that pack. Now we have had a difficulty. I mean, for 4 years you had Donald Trump as president of the United States, who said that this thing is a hoax, and completely discombobulated the U.S. position on climate change. However, I don't want to be unkind, but however inadequate it might have been. You had the president of Brazil following suit. Are we at a tipping point now, an unfortunate tipping point, where what used to be the experience of countries like Jamaica, small island states in particular, in terms of the worst consequences of climate change, is now visiting some of these deniers or visiting some of these prime emitters? So we see, for example, the worst drought in where was it? The worst heat
China.
wave in China on record. We see in Brazil floods that surpass all previous records. We have record-breaking wildfires in India. Are we at a tipping point now that some of these countries that have been less than forthcoming in addressing this issue and in securing the reduction targets are at a point now where, since they wouldn't hear the feeling it, as my grandmother would say, and so they may be inclined now to be more responsive?
I'll agree with the first part. Yes, the impacts, they are starting to see it more severely now. They were experiencing it before. It's just that, the intensity of it might not have felt so important at that time. So yes, they are feeling it now. Developed, like countries in the tropical regions, us and, sub-Saharan Africa and those places, we're still going to feel the worst of it. But more developed nations, these huge emitters, are starting to get those impacts. I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know if this is really going to incline. What it will do is probably mobilize more civil society and grassroots movements to say, listen, we are having this now. Everybody needs to come to the table and make some serious decisions and take some action. I think that if you were always a climate denier, in that position of power, let's say a president or a prime minister or whatever, it would not be, if I'm thinking from a political standpoint, it's rare to see them pivot and say, okay, yes, climate change is real, let's take action. I think even the dangerous thing is that they probably hunker down.
Well, the reason why that is important, is because it is perhaps through that kind of intensity of the conversation, civil society and so on, it has to be placed on the agenda of the voters. The voters now must start adding it to its list of criteria that it is going to use to determine who it votes for or who it elects as government, particularly in those big countries that are doing most of the emitting.
Absolutely. I'm very happy that you said that, because that's the whole reason I, as an advocate, continue to speak about, the impacts of climate change and what we need to do as the general public, as civil society, as, even private sector, because for private sector, your whole business models, your infrastructure, the sustainability and viability of your businesses are in danger because of climate change. It's not just physical impacts, it's all the social and economic impacts that are going to be a result of these events that happen and the frequency of these events. So I continue to talk about it, and that's why I will wake up at 4 a.m. to do this, because it's important for people to put some pressure on their political decision makers and policy makers to say, this needs to be in your manifesto, this needs to be in your policy agenda. We need to see how you are going to address climate action, especially as Jamaica and the Caribbean, as smaller emitters, as smaller countries. How are we going to bring it to the table of these bigger countries for these decisions to be made? Like, what's the plan of action? That's what we need to see.
Well, I'm again so grateful that you agreed to wake up at this hour, and I'm not going to allow you to go back to bed yet. Hold on 1 minute. I want to bring on Dr. Patricia Green, who I don't know if you know. Pat is a professional architect, but she's also a conservationist, and climate change is part of her passion. Do we have her on the line, Dr. Patricia Green?
Yes.
Hi,
Good
Pat.
afternoon. Good afternoon. Hi, Danielle. Lovely hearing you, and very interesting what you're saying. Thank you.
Pat,
Thank you, Dr. Green.
This lady, Miss Nembhard, who I woke up out of her bed in Australia, she has put the brightest expression on my face since this discussion started, because it seems, and we have had some very interesting, comments. Professor Clayton was very helpful in terms of dissecting for us and just laying out what this thing really means and what we need to do. But when you get down to the nuts and bolts of trying to see who is pumping all this stuff into the atmosphere, why are they doing it, what do they need to do to eliminate or significantly reduce that impact that they're having, how can they do that, How can they be helped to do that? It seems to me that if that is the approach, part of the difficulty I found, you see, certainly in the COP meetings that I had to do with, was that the conversation, perhaps necessarily so, was so adversarial that the likelihood of getting a consensus was very weak. And I came to the view that, look, it's no point in trying to say to these guys, well, we're going to pass a vote and we're going to use that vote and beat you over the head so that you conform. Somehow, we have to create in the minds of all of these, particularly the powerful ones, that, look, this is not just for us, this is for you as well. Are we making any progress there?
I have been listening to the conversation and trying to see now what can I bring to this conversation that has not already been said, because everybody has made very valid points. And I would like to remind everyone is that the whole notion of global warming came about in 1975. It came about through the University of Columbia University in New York. And then afterwards, this whole term climate change came about in 1979. So we're talking about terms that have evolved recently. And one of the things that I would like to share is that this whole notion of climate is a historic phenomenon. It is nothing new, particularly in our environment of Jamaica, in our environment as small island developing states. When I look back at history, I see intensity in the hurricanes. I see 4 hurricanes happening in 1 year in 1780s, in the 1780s. In the entire decade of the 1780s, there were about 10 different storms. The entire town of Savlamar, twice in that period, was destroyed. Ships, and there were 2 boats and a schooner that had come out of the ocean, had carried it, the water carried it all the way up the main street in Savlamar, and it lodged on mango trees. I mean, that's the intensity of hurricanes, and it happened in Jamaica, and it went to the rest of the Caribbean. So we've always had intensity. I think one of the key things that's happening to us today, one, we kind of are short-sighted in our discussion about these things. In other words, there's a history which goes back, the whole notion of climate and what Danielle is saying about fossil fuels, etc., as we have already heard, came about with the Industrial Revolution, and it was in the 1830s, just before we had the abolition of enslavement. So from that time, people have been warning about climate. As a student in the 70s, when I went to London to study, it was fog. We never had sunshine because of the coals coming out of they were using coal for heating, and the place was foggy. The buildings were fogged, were black soot. Now they're cleaned. So, we've always had these issues. So I would like us to think long term and not so short term. Short term, we have international media. So there's a fire happening in China, and we know about it immediately. In fact, sometimes even before it happens in Jamaica. And that is what we're dealing with. It really is a situation of immediacy with news and sensationalism, as opposed to there being any intensity. And I do admit, yes, if the term is climate change, yes, we have climate change. I do admit, if the term that's coined is global warming, yes, we do have global warming and we do have climate change. But it is really not a new phenomenon on the earth.
Danielle, let me ask you this. If we were to be having this discussion 5 years from now, are we going to be simply repeating ourselves, or are we going to be checking some boxes to say, well, thank God we have made some progress here, should have done better there, but we seem to be getting closer to where we need to go? What would you expect? Or what do you hope for? No, I don't know. I don't want to
What
hear.
I hope for.
I don't know. I don't want to hear what you hope for. What do you expect
boy.
realistically is likely to happen?
I mean, realistically, I think that it's an uphill battle that we will continue to advocate for and to fight for. I think that to Dr. Green's point, yes, climate change has, it's a historical phenomenon. I think human-driven climate change, because of the increased rate of carbon emissions, is a different beast that we're dealing with. And I think at some point we really need to trust the science. And I hope that the science is enough for us to make those decisions. In the next 5 years, I'm not certain that we'll see what we need to see based on how things are happening now. But as I said the last time I was on, I have nothing to hold on to but hope right now. So I would hope that we make some better decisions that secure the livelihood and future for all of us.
One of the things that gives me some hope is that I'm told, for example, that some of the car companies, I'm told Volvo, for example, Volvo has already taken a decision that as of a particular year, I don't know what that year is, it will no longer be producing internal combustion engines. Everything is going to be electric. So we may find ourselves in a position where the lovers of the old gasoline guzzling, carbon emitting vehicles won't be able, once the ones that we have reached the end of their life, you're going to have to shift. And perhaps that is necessary in terms of the transition that we need to make. I'm just trying to see now, how close do we seem to be getting, whether we're going there enthusiastically or we're being dragged kicking and screaming.
I think we're being dragged.
How are we getting to that point, Pat?
I think we're being dragged kicking and screaming. What is happening? It's very easy for us to calculate the effects of climate change because the intelligence, the computer science and these things can actually predict it. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, number 11, speaks about cities, predicts the increase in cities that are coming by 2030, and therefore making recommendations as to strategies to mitigate and adapt in terms of what's happening in our cities with climate change and other social issues. Now, what is important is that a number of cities since the 19th century, they have increased. We have high-rise buildings. We have greater population densities in these cities. And, they're intruding, they're building on water. And so all kinds of things, displacement. We talk about what is happening at Hellshire, it was discussed earlier today. But somehow we kind of are being short-sighted because over the last few years we have intensively been dredging the Kingston Harbour. So if you do this, there is a if and then. So if you're doing that, then there is a repercussion, and it can be predicted. We have computer programs that can actually predict. So the scientists can actually look at the city. You can model the city. They do it in Singapore. You can go online on Singapore and you can see everything. That if they build 20 or 30 high-rise buildings in this area, the amount of carbon emissions and the fossil fuel projections will be X, Y, and Z. And so because of that, that's how they are now saying your building is a green building. Therefore, you need to put these things in place for mitigation strategies. Now, how do we handle mitigation and adaptation strategies in Jamaica? We are building, but are we doing the projections to see if this kind of building is suitable and if it is, we hear people say it's a sustainable building, but have we defined for ourselves as a small island developing state, as Jamaica, what is the definition of sustainability?
That was not in the building code.
Is the building code being followed? Are people understanding the building code? And who are the professionals and technical experts who are following the building code and ensuring that these things are being applied? One of the key things that we're seeing, we're having some emails being circulated with photographs of, images of high-rise buildings with sandbags around them. Why? We have put up these high-rise buildings. We have put basements in them. The first rainfall that is coming since the building has been constructed, the basements are being flooded. The parking way is being flooded. Why are we building basements in Jamaica? I mean, basements in New York are flooding when they had the storm going up into New York, and the persons in North America, Canada, and so on who are expecting Fiona are worrying if they have a basement apartment.
Well, that's the other facet of the issue, because accepting the principle, recognizing what ought to be done is one thing, but being faithful and obedient to it is another. Let me ask Danielle this question. We have a few more minutes to go. Tell me, and I know it may be fantasizing, but is it possible, if we were ever able to get it right in terms of the things we do and our protection of the ozone and so on, is it possible to correct, to repair some of the damage we have done, or just a matter of cauterizing it? In other words, if the ice cap stops melting, are we likely to see sea levels go back down? Is it possible?
Okay. There are some, once we don't pass a specific tipping point, I would say, yes, it's possible for, ecosystems and different structures to restore themselves over time. How long that's going to take is not something I can answer right now, especially because there are other disturbances that affect these things. There are other things that affect coral reefs. There are other things that affect, river systems and watersheds in terms of pollution and everything else like that. So there's a lot of what they call latency in the system. So if we decided to cut off all emissions today, if a miracle happened or something else happened and we didn't emit anything, there's so much energy in the system, so much carbon already emitted, that we will still continue to see impacts for a long time, and we'll have to address those impacts as they come along. But listen, nature is nature. It is cyclical. It's always going to restore itself. It's going to take new forms. It's going to do what it needs to do. We're trying to secure the human element, the societal element, the civilization element of it through wise decisions around climate action.
As a marine scientist, can you tell us what impact is climate change having on the fisheries?
Right now, there's still a lot of work being done on that. We're having extended and more severe events of coral bleaching, which is where, to simplify it, corals are symbiotic, so they have the coral itself, which is a polyp like a jellyfish, and then it has algae inside.
What's causing the bleaching?
Sea surface temperatures are increasing and lasting for longer periods, and it's putting the corals and their algae under stress. So they evict the algae, and without the algae, they can't eat, and then they bleach, and then unfortunately, sometimes they die if they're not able to recover after a certain period of time. The corals are the building blocks of reefs, so fish live in them, they use it as their habitats, they use it as their nurseries, they use it as their feeding grounds. If there's no coral, then a huge subsection of fish either move to another reef, or they, sometimes, the evidence on their life cycle is unclear right now, but they certainly don't occupy that reef anymore. So if you are a community that was dependent on that reef, you'll see the impacts in your fisheries. There are other studies about ocean acidification. So the ocean is a carbon sink. So as carbon is emitted in the atmosphere, things like forests and oceans and peatlands absorb that carbon. Unfortunately, they're not able to absorb it at a fast enough rate for how much we're emitting right now. But as the ocean absorbs carbon, it becomes more acidic. That also has effects on the reef in that, the carbon skeleton of the reef becomes more brittle. So as we get, storms and huge waves, it basically just breaks off pieces of coral. And again, you remove that foundation building block for your fisheries. Ocean acidification has impacts on fish bones and structure, as well as, some people are doing studies about it affects their sensory perception to like predation and things like that. All kinds of things are happening. And of course, because everything is connected, as things affect land, it affects the sea and vice versa. So if you have upland impacts of climate change on like your watershed, it will have downstream impacts on coral reefs as well, which will impact the fisheries. So it's a lot.
Pat, tell me, from a planning point of view, Jamaica, of course, we're not a major emitter, but because we're a small country, small population, but proportionally, we probably, are making our own contribution to the climate disaster that we're having. What would you say to us are the 1, 2, 3 must-dos from a planning point of view to reduce whatever negative impact we are having on the climate?
Wow. Thank you for that question. I am going to try to address it. And I want to segue from what Danielle has just explained. One of the key things is recognizing that our built environment and our natural environment are intertwined, that they both coexist in a symbiotic way. So when we are building and doing planning and development, and we have omitted the central sewage system and tertiary treatment of our sewage, and we are offloading this kind of sewage into the Kingston Harbor, then we're going to have a breakdown of the various, the life of the ocean. And when the life in the ocean is destroyed, because the coral reefs, the mangroves, and all of these help to break the current and the impact of weather. So we have a storm coming or a hurricane coming, and it's coming towards our city. Then one of the things that helps to break the impact of this are the reefs and also the mangroves. So when the Kingston Harbor or all our harbors are destroyed because of development and the sewage, then you're going to have the wind and the seas just coming straight in, and the entire city will be destroyed or badly damaged. So that's one thing. Looking at how we offload our development on inside the environment. And you have mentioned things like the trees and the leaves being a canopy. I would also like to add that the trees actually act as windbreakers. Historically on the sugar plantation, they had windbreakers. So we have Holland bamboo, the avenue. It really was a windbreaker for the plantation. So you had these series of trees that helped to cushion and soften the impact of hurricanes and storm winds. So that's one. The second one is that we have to recognize that we are contributing to this whole carbon emission discussion. And in our planning and development, we need to recognize what are sustainable buildings and sustainable designs that we have come up with historically in our environment, and begin to put many of those principles in place. And we're hearing China being called a lot, and in terms of carbon emission, but there are a number of buildings that are being allowed on our landscape which are totally foreign to the climatic environment of Jamaica and to the culture of Jamaica. And if we look historically, we have seen where our architecture and our design development of cities have evolved as a response to their mitigation and adaptation strategies as a result of hurricanes and earthquakes. And so what is happening is a new kind of introduction of building construction and design types that totally ignore the fact that Jamaica and the islands, vulnerable islands, small island developing states, have a specific pattern, weather, climatic pattern. And so we're erecting things that are adding to carbon emissions instead of reducing it. Thirdly, so therefore we need to go back and look at, as part of adaptation, to look at some of the strategies that have evolved and integrate it in a modern way. So we still look modern. You know, we're growing and your grandchildren need to enjoy something that belongs to them of their time, but there are principles that need to be applied. And finally, I am still thinking that in the discussion, we have to remember God, because there are some people who say that climate is really an act of God. And in the Bible, in fact, when you read in Jeremiah, there are those who will tell you that God has actually said, if you sin, then I will. I will send the fires, and I will send the floods, and all these kinds of things. So we have to remember that there is also the,
running out of time.
The natural and the physical and the spiritual.
Yeah.
Those are the three things. Thank you for allowing me to do that.
Thank you. Danielle, one last question before we go. Are you satisfied that the alternatives in terms of generating energy, the renewables, are you satisfied that they are sufficiently robust to provide all the energy that the world requires, and that this can be done in a way that will not marginalize people in poor countries in Africa and in Asia, in Latin America?
Mr. Golin, that is such a loaded question that I cannot answer in a short period of time. I would say that it's beyond just the technology to determine whether or not marginalization will, or continued marginalization will happen. I think intentional discussions have to be had around how we will transition in a just and equitable way towards renewable and alternative source of energy, so that we don't replicate or reinforce any type of exclusion or marginalization,
Yes,
or you know,
yes.
some would say even oppression.
And it means that the cost of that is going to have to be spread appropriately. That's where we have to leave it. Thank you both very much, Dr. Patricia Green and
Thank you.
Ms. Danielle Nembhard. Thank you, Danielle, for getting up so early to join us.
No worries. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Green.
That's
Thanks
it for us
thank you,
today. We're a
Danielle.
little over time, but thank you so much. It's been a good program, I think, talking about climate change. We'll be back here next week, Monday, talk about something else, and talk with some other guests as we delve into issues that are of concern to all of us. God bless you.